In the first years of the Second World War, Germany looked like a force that had solved the problem of modern campaigning. It moved faster than its opponents expected, coordinated armor, infantry, and aircraft with startling efficiency, and turned confusion into collapse. To many observers, those early victories seemed to prove that Germany possessed a superior way of war, a kind of unstoppable momentum. But momentum is not the same as endurance. What Germany demonstrated in 1939 and 1940 was the ability to win time. What it failed to demonstrate, and what it ultimately did not possess, was the ability to win a long industrial war against a coalition with larger resources, deeper strategic depth, and the capacity to learn. Germany's failure was not caused by one single battle or one dramatic mistake, and it was not simply a matter of bad luck. It was the result of structural limits and repeated choices that compounded those limits. Over time, the war became less about spectacular maneuvers and more about production, logistics, fuel, manpower, and strategic coherence. In that kind of contest, Germany faced disadvantages that could be delayed but not erased. The longer the war ran, the more the underlying arithmetic asserted itself. A central fact is that Germany entered the war without the resource base required for a global conflict. It lacked secure access to large quantities of oil, and oil was the bloodstream of mechanized war. Tanks, trucks, aircraft, ships, and even much of the industrial economy depended on petroleum products. Germany tried to compensate with synthetic fuel derived from coal, but synthetic production was costly, vulnerable, and insufficient for a war that expanded in scale. When the conflict broadened, fuel constraints turned from an inconvenience into a strategic choke point. A powerful army that cannot move and an air force that cannot train are not powerful for long. Germany also lacked the combined industrial capacity of its enemies. Even before the United States entered the war, Britain's maritime access and imperial resources, combined with Soviet manpower and depth, posed a long-term challenge. Once the United States joined, the industrial balance became overwhelming. Industrial war rewards those who can replace losses quickly and continuously. Germany could produce advanced weapons and high-quality equipment, but it struggled to match the aggregate output of multiple great powers mobilized for total war. Over time, the ability to build more aircraft, more tanks, more trucks, and more ammunition mattered more than having the best individual model. Quantity became a form of quality when it could be sustained month after month. Germany's strategic problem was made worse by its expanding objectives. Early successes encouraged an escalation of goals from limited geopolitical gains to broad domination and ideological conquest. That shift had practical consequences. Wars with limited aims can sometimes be ended through negotiation, armistice, or political settlement. Wars framed as existential, racial, or ideological struggles tend to remove compromise from the table. Germany's policies and rhetoric often ensured that its enemies viewed defeat as intolerable and surrender as deadly. When opponents believe that losing means annihilation, they fight longer and accept far higher costs. In that environment, Germany's early shock victories produced resistance rather than submission. The decision to invade the Soviet Union in 1941 is often treated as the pivotal turning point, and it was indeed a strategic gamble of enormous scale. But the reasons it contributed to failure go beyond the simplistic idea that it opened a second front. The Eastern Front was not just another theater. It was a vast space with punishing distances, poor infrastructure in many regions, and extreme seasonal conditions. German operational planning repeatedly underestimated the logistics of sustaining large mechanized forces across hundreds and then thousands of kilometers. In the early phase, rapid advances outran supply. Fuel and ammunition had to travel farther over damaged roads and mismatched rail networks. Maintenance demands multiplied as engines and tracks wore out. Units that appeared strong on paper became weaker in practice because their vehicles could not be repaired fast enough and their supplies could not arrive fast enough. The Soviet Union also possessed strategic depth that absorbed shocks. Even catastrophic losses in 1941 did not end the war, because Soviet industry could be relocated, manpower could be mobilized, and new armies could be formed. Germany's planning relied heavily on the assumption that the Soviet state would collapse quickly under pressure. When that collapse did not occur, Germany faced a grinding war of attrition that it was not designed, economically or politically, to win. The longer the Eastern Front continued, the more Germany's initial advantages in training and operational coordination were consumed by sheer scale and loss. Logistics on the Eastern Front were shaped by basic constraints that no amount of willpower could change. Railways were vital for moving heavy supplies, but the Soviet rail gauge differed from the European standard, requiring conversion or transshipment. That cost time and labor. Roads were often unpaved and seasonal mud could immobilize traffic. The famous autumn Rasputitsa turned movement into slow, exhausting hauling. Winter brought extreme cold that affected engines, lubricants, batteries, and human endurance. These conditions did not defeat Germany by themselves, but they magnified existing supply weaknesses and increased the cost of every operation. A plan that depends on rapid advance becomes fragile when speed is taken away. Germany's leadership decisions often made this fragility worse. At key moments, operational flexibility was reduced by political interference. Retreats that might have saved forces were delayed or forbidden. Units were ordered to hold positions long after their supply situation made holding unrealistic. When encirclements occurred, the insistence on holding ground for symbolic reasons turned military setbacks into catastrophes. A modern army survives by trading space for time when necessary, preserving combat power for future operations. When that option is politically blocked, the army can be bled out in place. Germany also faced the strategic reality of fighting maritime powers without adequate naval superiority. Britain's survival meant that Germany did not achieve the decisive political outcome it needed in the West. The failure to neutralize Britain ensured that Germany remained exposed to blockade, air attack, and the eventual opening of additional fronts. The Battle of the Atlantic became a long struggle over supply lines. Submarines inflicted significant losses, but they did not cut Britain off completely, and Allied anti-submarine methods improved. Once the United States entered, the Atlantic became a massive logistical highway, enabling sustained deliveries of food, fuel, weapons, and troops. Germany could not match this maritime capacity, and its ability to import scarce materials declined under blockade pressure. Air power became another arena where Germany's early lead turned into a late disadvantage. The Luftwaffe entered the war experienced and effective, but it was not structured for a prolonged strategic air contest against multiple enemies. Training systems, fuel availability, and replacement pipelines were all strained. As the war progressed, Germany's pilot training hours declined, especially when fuel became scarce. Experience is critical in air combat. Losing veteran pilots faster than they can be replaced leads to a rapid drop in effectiveness. Meanwhile, the Allies expanded training programs and industrial output. By 1944, Allied air forces could field large numbers of aircraft and crews, sustain losses, and maintain continuous pressure. Strategic bombing compounded Germany's difficulties. Bombing did not instantly collapse German production, but it forced dispersal, consumed resources in air defense, damaged infrastructure, and disrupted fuel production. Oil facilities and synthetic plants were particularly vulnerable. As fuel supplies worsened, Germany's ability to train pilots, move armored units, and even conduct routine logistics diminished. A fighter aircraft without fuel is a stationary object. A tank without fuel is a bunker. When fuel becomes the limiting factor, tactical skill and technical quality cannot fully compensate. Germany's weapons and procurement strategy also produced long-term problems. The pursuit of technologically advanced and often complex systems created impressive machines but sometimes reduced standardization and repairability. A war economy benefits from simpler designs that can be produced in huge numbers, maintained in the field, and repaired with available parts. Germany did not entirely ignore this logic, but it often prioritized performance and innovation even when the industrial situation demanded mass production and ease of maintenance. As the war turned against Germany, wonder weapons and late-stage innovations could not reverse the broader imbalance. New technology arriving in small numbers cannot compensate for a system that is losing fuel, factories, trained crews, and transport capacity. Another factor was the human dimension of manpower and labor. Germany mobilized millions of soldiers, but its demographic base was smaller than the combined base of its opponents. The Soviet Union could field enormous forces despite devastating casualties. The United States could raise and equip large armies while also sustaining global production. Britain could draw on Commonwealth manpower and maintain naval and air operations. Germany attempted to offset shortages by using forced labor and by extracting resources from occupied territories, but occupation itself required garrisons and security forces. Moreover, exploitation policies often produced resistance rather than cooperation. Partisan warfare and sabotage forced Germany to divert troops and resources to rear area security, weakening the front. This links to one of the most decisive, though sometimes understated reasons for Germany's failure: its occupation policies and ideological violence. Brutality in occupied regions, especially in the East, was not merely a moral atrocity, it was also strategically self-defeating. Harsh rule, mass killings, and exploitation turned potential sources of support or neutrality into determined enemies. Instead of stabilizing territories and tapping their resources efficiently, Germany created widespread resistance. Every act of terror increased the need for security troops, escalated insurgency, and destroyed economic productivity. It also hardened the resolve of Allied populations and governments. A war conducted as annihilation tends to produce total resistance. Germany's alliance structure also weakened its position. It relied on partners whose capabilities varied widely and whose equipment and training often lagged behind. On the Eastern Front, Allied armies sometimes held extended flanks with limited anti-tank resources. When major Soviet offensives struck these sectors, breakthroughs could occur rapidly, leading to encirclements of German forces. Germany could not fully solve this problem because it lacked sufficient forces to hold every sector with its strongest units. This was a structural consequence of overextension. When a front is too long, someone must hold a section with less strength, and an adaptable enemy will attack that section. Over time, Germany lost the strategic initiative. Early in the war, it chose the timing and location of major operations. Later, it increasingly reacted to Allied moves. Reaction is costly because it forces hurried decisions and reduces the ability to concentrate force. The Allies, with growing resources, could open new fronts, conduct strategic bombing, and mount large offensives that compelled German redeployment. Each redeployment strained rail networks and fuel reserves. Each shift created gaps elsewhere. The war became a constant balancing act in which Germany was always short of something essential. The Western Front, once reopened in force by the Allies, exposed additional German weaknesses. By 1944, the Allies possessed overwhelming air superiority in many areas. That superiority constrained German movement in daylight and made it difficult to concentrate forces without being detected and attacked. German units could still fight effectively on the ground, and they often did, but they faced a strategic environment in which resupply, reinforcement, and maneuver were increasingly dangerous. Meanwhile, Allied logistics, especially through ports and massive supply systems, allowed sustained operations. Industrial output translated into trucks, fuel, and spare parts that kept armies moving. The internal structure of Germany's war economy also mattered. Mobilization was significant, but it was not always optimized early enough for the scale of the conflict. Competing agencies, bureaucratic infighting, and political priorities distorted production decisions. Coordination problems are less visible than battlefield defeats, but they shape how many aircraft appear on airfields, how quickly damaged tanks return to service, and how many trained replacements arrive at the front. As the war progressed and conditions deteriorated, these coordination challenges became harder to manage, not easier. There is also the problem of strategic coherence at the highest level. Germany pursued multiple major goals: defeating Britain or forcing it out of the war, conquering large parts of the Soviet Union, controlling the Mediterranean situation, and later defending against an increasingly powerful Allied coalition. These goals competed for resources and attention. In a war of limited means, choosing priorities is essential. Germany often attempted to do too much at once, believing that boldness could compensate for scarcity. Boldness can win battles, but it cannot create fuel, shorten distances, or replace industrial capacity. A related issue was the tendency to treat willpower as a substitute for material reality. This is a psychological pattern that appears in many failing campaigns. Leaders respond to bad news by demanding more effort, more sacrifice, and more rigidity, as if discipline can change the laws of supply. Discipline matters, but it does not refuel as empty tanks. When Germany's situation worsened, orders often became more absolute. Hold here, counterattack there, never retreat. These commands may have appeared resolute, but they frequently increased losses without producing strategic benefit. Germany's failure was accelerated by the cumulative effect of attrition. Modern war consumes trained personnel. It consumes officers who know how to coordinate units, pilots who have mastered aerial combat, mechanics who keep engines running, and logisticians who know how to move supplies under pressure. As experienced cadres are lost, the quality of replacements becomes critical. Germany's replacement system struggled as the war dragged on, especially in areas like aviation where training required time and fuel. The Allies, especially the United States, could expand training pipelines at industrial scale. The Soviet Union, despite enormous losses, could produce new units and leaders through a combination of necessity, adaptation, and a vast pool of manpower. Germany, facing shrinking resources, saw the overall quality of its force erode. Another decisive factor was intelligence and adaptation. The Allies improved their ability to read German intentions, locate submarines, and target critical infrastructure. Germany achieved successes in intelligence and deception at times, but the overall balance shifted. When a side can anticipate supply routes, break codes, or locate production bottlenecks, it can apply pressure more efficiently. The war was not only fought with bullets, it was also fought with information. As Allied capabilities in this domain grew, Germany faced increasing difficulty concealing movements and protecting key assets. As the war continued, the German home front also came under growing strain. Bombing raids, shortages, and the loss of territory eroded living conditions and disrupted production. Civilian morale and productivity are not just sentimental topics. They affect how many hours factories run, how quickly repairs are made, and how well transportation systems function. A society under constant attack can continue to work, but the cost increases, and the margin for error shrinks. Germany's leadership attempted to maintain control through propaganda and repression, but control does not repair bridges or restore oil plants. When Germany attempted major offensives later in the war, such as the Ardennes attack, these operations demonstrated a remaining capacity for tactical surprise, but also highlighted strategic desperation. They consumed fuel and elite units that could not be replaced. Even when they achieved initial success, they could not change the larger balance of resources and air power. A dramatic offensive might temporarily disrupt an enemy's plans, but if it fails to destroy the enemy's capacity, it can become a final expenditure of strength rather than a turning point. By late 1944 and 1945, Germany faced converging disasters. In the east, Soviet offensives drove rapidly westward, supported by massive artillery, armor, and logistics. In the west, Allied forces advanced with deep supply systems and near-total air dominance in many sectors. Germany's transportation network was damaged. Fuel was scarce. Training was degraded. Industrial sites were disrupted. Fronts were collapsing faster than they could be stabilized. In this stage, even competent tactical defense could not compensate for systemic collapse. It is important to understand that the German armed forces were not defeated because their soldiers stopped fighting. In many places, they fought fiercely until the end. They were defeated because the state and the war system behind them could no longer sustain the requirements of modern combat. When an army cannot replace losses, cannot move supplies, cannot provide fuel, and cannot maintain air cover, it becomes progressively less capable regardless of the courage of its individuals. Courage can delay defeat. It cannot reverse a structural imbalance that grows larger every month. Logistical burdens. Logistical burdens. Logistical burdens. Logistical burdens created operational crises. Operational crises were worsened by political rigidity. Political rigidity increased losses. Losses reduced quality. Reduced quality increased losses further. Meanwhile, the enemy coalition grew stronger, more coordinated, and more capable of applying pressure in multiple domains at once. This was not a single collapse, it was a tightening net. If one wants a final, plain explanation suitable for a narrator, it is this. Germany failed because it tried to fight and win a long war against opponents whose combined resources and industrial capacity exceeded its own, while simultaneously pursuing expansive, uncompromising goals that ensured maximal resistance, and while making strategic and political decisions that turned setbacks into disasters. The early war awarded speed and surprise. The later war rewarded endurance, logistics, and production. Germany excelled at the first and could not sustain the second. The lesson is not that victory is guaranteed by size alone. Smaller powers can sometimes win, but in this case, the difference was not small. The coalition against Germany grew to include the world's largest industrial economy, a maritime empire with global supply access, and a continental power with enormous manpower and depth. Against that combination, Germany needed either a rapid, decisive outcome early or a strategy that avoided overextension and preserved the possibility of settlement. It achieved neither. It chose expansion, ideological war, and rigidity. As time passed, the gap between ambition and capacity widened until it became an abyss.
When the narrator reaches the end of this story, the tone does not need triumph or melodrama. The reality is more instructive and more severe. Wars are won by systems as much as by battles. Systems require resources, transport, training, and coherent strategy. When a state builds a war on the assumption that opponents will collapse quickly, it is borrowing from the future. If the future arrives and the collapse does not happen, the debt must be paid in fuel, in men, in machines, and in time. Germany ran out of all of these, and it ran out of them while facing enemies who were gaining more of them every day.